It was the fall of 1978 when the first missing poster appeared on the streetlights of Savannah, Georgia. Melissa Bennett, name changed, 12, had left her ballet class on a rainy Tuesday in November and never made it home. The poster, printed on faded yellow paper, showed a girl with brown hair tied back in a bun, still wearing her pink dance leotard and smiling shyly at the camera. That recital photograph, chosen by her desperate parents, would be the first in a series that would transform the sleepy coastal region of Georgia into a landscape of silent fear for the next 7 years. The late 1970s witnessed an America in transition. The echoes of Watergate still reverberated, the energy crisis was leaving its mark, and conservatism was gaining traction in the suburbs of cities like Savannah, Brunswick, and St. Mary's. Georgia's coastal communities experienced a peculiar duality. The southern charm and hospitality of tree-lined streets contrasted with the growing rigidity of traditional values and community vigilance. Local newspapers, still printed on old-school typefaces, devoted their headlines to topics like inflation, foreign policy, and occasionally petty crime. The idea that a predator could lurk among the polite smiles and "good morning, sir" exchanged in grocery stores seemed absurd. Melissa Bennett's disappearance was initially treated as just another teenage runaway case. "These girls, you know how it is, heads full of Hollywood dreams," one Savannah Police Department officer commented, as recorded in notes from the first day of the investigation. America was beginning to recognize the phenomenon of juvenile disappearances, but the prevailing mindset still attributed such incidents to teenage rebellion and romanticism. The Bennett family, however, insisted that something was deeply wrong. Melissa would never miss her Thursday class. It was her solo, her mother repeated, clutching the small point shoes she had found under her daughter's bed. 3 months passed without any concrete leads. The winter of 1978-1979 was particularly harsh on the Georgia coast, with temperatures dropping to unusually low levels for the region. The Bennett case gradually slipped from the front pages to minor notes in the police section, until in February 1979, 13-year-old Diane Reynolds, name changed, disappeared after leaving her ballet class in Brunswick, about 80 miles south of Savannah. The town of Brunswick, with its approximately 17,000 inhabitants in the late 1970s, was known for its shrimp processing industry and the quiet atmosphere of a typical southern port community. The Brunswick Academy of Classical Dance occupied a renovated warehouse near the port, and Diane had been studying classical ballet there since she was 5. On that particular day, a Thursday, she had stayed after her regular class to practice a sequence for her spring recital. Her teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Wilkins, name changed, recalled seeing her emerge through the back door around 6:30 p.m., wearing a denim jacket over her black training leotard, carrying her dance bag with its distinctive ballet slipper embroidery. The similarities between the cases weren't immediately noticed by local police. Only when Diane's father, a marine engineer who occasionally worked in Savannah, mentioned the Bennett case during an impromptu press conference did some reporters begin to draw parallels. Both were ballet students, both had disappeared after classes, both were from middle-class families, and neither had a history of behavioral problems or significant family discord. Winter gave way to spring in 1979, and as Georgia's peach trees blossomed, fear began to take root in coastal communities. Dance studios introduced strict exit rules. No student could leave the facility without an adult accompanying them. Parents organized carpooling schemes, and local AM radio stations devoted more time to safety tips for children and teenagers. The carefree atmosphere characteristic of those small towns gave way to nervous vigilance. It was during this period that an additional element began to emerge in the investigation: the mention of a specific vehicle. A dark blue Chevrolet Impala, a 1976 or 1977 model, had been seen parked near the Savannah Dance Academy on the day of Melissa's disappearance, according to a belated report from a local business owner. In Brunswick, a similar witness, a package delivery driver, reported noticing a similar car, with partially visible Georgia license plates near the dance academy on the day Diane was last seen. The descriptions were vague and surfaced only after newspapers began speculating about a possible pattern, but they offered the first tangible line of inquiry. The summer of 1979 brought a period of relative calm. State authorities formed a special task force composed of detectives from Savannah, Brunswick, and the Georgia State Police, but the results were limited. The FBI was consulted, but with only 2 cases and little physical evidence, its involvement remained superficial, limited to occasional consultations. The press alternated between keeping the case alive and accusing the police of incompetence, while the Bennett and Reynolds families endured the torturous experience of not knowing, neither being able to grieve nor fully moving on. In September 1979, 11-year-old Amanda Lawrence, name changed, disappeared in St. Mary's, a small port town near the Florida border. The case followed the pattern: ballet student disappearance after class, no direct witnesses. This time, however, there was a new element. Amanda was the last person seen leaving the gym's parking lot, and a newly installed security camera at the adjacent gas station partially captured a dark car following her. The image was grainy, typical of the limited surveillance technologies of the late 1970s, but it confirmed the model of an Impala and partially showed the silhouette of the driver, a man of average build wearing what appeared to be a cap or hat. The fall of 1979 would bring an unexpected development. A fisherman found a small ballet slipper tangled in his gear in the Okefenokee swamp. The piece, severely deteriorated from exposure to the elements, was later identified as belonging to Melissa Bennett through a small tag sewn with her initials, a common practice among dance students. The discovery, though macabre, did not provide conclusive evidence about the girl's fate, but it did direct the search toward the vast marshland that stretched across southeastern Georgia. As 1979 drew to a close, an atmosphere of intense vigilance enveloped the small coastal towns. Dance studios canceled evening performances, parents escorted their daughters even to daytime activities, and the local news devoted regular segments to what was now being called the ballerina's affair. The holiday season was marked by unusual restraint, with fewer decorations on main streets and community events scaled back or cancelled. Fear had settled in like an unwelcome inhabitant of these communities. The 1980s marked a shift in the investigation. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, formally assumed leadership of the case, centralizing operations in a temporary office in Brunswick. A special hotline was established to receive anonymous tips, and posters bearing the faces of the 3 girls were distributed throughout the state and neighboring regions of Florida and South Carolina. The case began to gain national attention, with mentions on programs such as America's Most Wanted, then in its early years. It was in this context that the 4th disappearance occurred in March 1980. Samantha Perkins, name changed, 13, was last seen leaving her contemporary ballet class in Darien, a small town between Brunswick and Savannah. This time, the pattern varied. Samantha disappeared during the day around 4:30 p.m. on a Saturday. Most significantly, a witness, a teenager washing cars in the gym's parking lot, provided the most complete description yet. A Caucasian man in his 30s or 40s, with short brown hair and a normal father or teacher appearance, approached Samantha and offered her a ride. The boy noted that the man seemed to know the girl by name. The car, consistent with previous reports, was a dark blue Impala with a small dent in the rear bumper. The spring of 1980 brought an intensification of searches in the marshlands surrounding the Okefenokee, using sniffer dogs and specialized teams. During one such operation in May, investigators found what appeared to be a disposal site, a remote area, accessible only by boat or via a precarious trail, where personal items believed to belong to the girls were recovered. Hair ribbons, a small brooch shaped like a ballet slipper, and fragments of fabric that laboratory analysis later confirmed as dance leotards. The physical evidence, though limited, allowed for the construction of a preliminary profile of the suspect. GBI experts, consulting with forensic psychologists, drew the portrait of a methodical predator familiar with the coastal region, possibly with some prior connection to the dance world, perhaps a father, a student's brother, or a gym employee. The perpetrator demonstrated careful planning, choosing victims in different cities to reduce the likelihood of connections between cases, and utilizing local knowledge of the swamps to conceal evidence. The summer of 1980 marked a shift in the nature of the investigation. Police, now convinced they were dealing with a serial killer, adopted more aggressive tactics. Plainclothes officers were stationed near dance studios throughout the coastal region. Owners of blue Impalas were systematically interviewed, and victims' families were reinterrogated for any forgotten or overlooked details. At the same time, the GBI established a rudimentary database, revolutionary for the time, attempting to cross-reference information from criminal records, vehicle registrations, and school systems. The fall of 1980 brought heavy rains to coastal Georgia. The flooding, unusual for the season, exposed normally inaccessible areas of the marshes. It was during one of these floods that a park ranger, inspecting damage to a remote trail, made the discovery that would confirm everyone's worst fears. Human remains partially preserved in the marsh's acidic conditions were identified through dental records as belonging to Amanda Lawrence, the third victim. Forensic analysis, limited by the methods available in the early 1980s, failed to determine the exact cause of death, but confirmed that the body had been placed in that location around the time of her disappearance. The year 1981 began with a traumatized community and an investigation that now focused on two parallel objectives: locating the other victims and identifying the man in the blue Impala. The vehicle had become a tangible symbol of terror. Mothers shunned their children when similar cars passed by. Dance studios hired security guards to monitor parking lots, and residents reported almost daily sightings of suspicious Impalas to overwhelmed police. The big breakthrough would come in April 1981, when a retired St. Simon's Island teacher, reviewing old photographs of dance recitals for a community archive project, noticed a disturbing pattern. In 5 different photographs covering events from 1977 to 1980 in 3 different cities, the same man appeared among the audience, never prominently, always on the edges of the frame, but unmistakably the same person. In 2 of these photos, the victims could be seen on stage. The teacher, Ellen Whitaker, name changed, reported her discovery to the authorities. The photographs provided the first clear image of the suspect, a man of average height, appearing to be between 35 and 40 years old, with short brown hair, dressed conservatively in a dress shirt, sometimes wearing glasses. The quality of the images was typical of amateur photography of the time, slightly blurred, oversaturated, but good enough to generate a composite sketch that was widely distributed throughout the southeastern United States. In the summer of 1981, the profile was refined through interviews with Dance Academy employees. Several people recognized the man in the photographs as someone who occasionally appeared at recitals, sometimes identifying himself as a student's uncle or cousin, other times as a freelance photographer, interested in documenting cultural events for local newspapers. A name began to emerge from these interviews: Raymond Miller, real name, confirmed in public conviction records. Raymond Miller, 38 years old in 1981, worked as a maintenance technician for a company that serviced businesses along the Georgia coast. His job required frequent travel between the cities where the disappearances occurred, and company records confirmed his presence in the locations around the time of the incidents. Miller had no prior criminal record, other than a warning for trespassing in 1975, when he was found in the parking lot of an Atlanta dance school photographing students without permission. The investigation now had a clear focus. Surveillance on Miller was established, while detectives meticulously built the case. His movements coincided with the disappearances. His vehicle, confirmed through Georgia Department of Motor Vehicles records, was a navy blue 1977 Chevrolet Impala. His habits included frequent visits to dance studios, where he performed under various pretenses. More disturbing, Miller kept an extensive collection of recital programs and newspaper clippings related to youth ballet in his Brunswick apartment. The turning point came in September 1981, when, during a court-authorized search of Miller's rented garage, investigators found a shoebox containing small objects, what appeared to be souvenirs from the victims. Among these items were a hair ribbon identified by the Bennett family as belonging to Melissa, a diary marked "Property of Dr. Diane Reynolds' initials, and a slipper matching the one found in the swamp. Additionally, forensic analysis found microscopic fibers consistent with dance leotards in the Impala's trunk, and traces of soil characteristic of the swampy areas where Amanda Lawrence's body had been found. Raymond Miller was arrested on September 30, 1981, while performing maintenance on a commercial refrigeration system in Savannah. Newspapers at the time described the arrest as surprisingly peaceful. Miller offered no resistance and maintained a poker face throughout. His only recorded comment was the question, "Can I finish the job first?" A detail that forensic psychologists would later analyze as indicative of his methodical and detached nature. Miller's 3-day interrogation yielded limited results. The suspect denied any involvement in the disappearances, offering alternative explanations for the evidence. The souvenirs were found items. His presence in the cities was part of the job, his interest in ballet purely artistic. It was only when confronted with a specific photograph from a recital in which he was clearly seen observing Samantha Perkins that his composure began to falter. On October 7, 1981, during a particularly intense interrogation session, Miller finally spoke about the crimes, not in a direct confession, but through a disturbing hypothetical narrative. "If anyone wanted to do something like this," he began, "they would need to understand ballet, the discipline, the beauty of form. How to capture that perfect moment when a ballerina is between movements, suspended, as if time stands still." The monologue, recorded on cassette and later transcribed for the case file, continued for nearly an hour, with Miller describing in abstract but unmistakably revealing terms his fascination with preserving perfection before age destroys it. The search for more concrete information about the fate of the other victims continued. In November 1981, based on evidence gleaned from the interviews, search teams focused their efforts on a specific area of the Okefenokee Swamp, where remains identified as Diane Reynolds were eventually found. The search for Melissa Bennett and Samantha Perkins continued for the following years, but their bodies were never located, a fact that would weigh heavily on the community's collective conscience and the family's hearts for decades. Raymond Miller's trial began in March 1982 in Glynn County Superior Court in Brunswick. The 7-week trial attracted national attention and temporarily transformed the small port town into a media epicenter. The prosecution, led by Jacob Thornton, his real name according to public records, presented a meticulously constructed case, connecting Miller to the disappearances through physical evidence, testimony, and analysis by criminal behavior experts, a field still emerging in the early 1980s. The defense, for its part, attempted to portray Miller as an eccentric but harmless man, the victim of a biased investigation and a community searching for a scapegoat. Their lawyers questioned the reliability of the photographic identifications, argued that the souvenirs found could have been planted, and emphasized the absence of a formal confession. This strategy, however, weakened when former co-workers testified about disturbing comments Miller had made over the years, and when detailed travel records, meticulously kept in personal diaries, revealed a pattern impossible to ignore. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Amanda Lawrence's mother was called to testify. In a moving but controlled testimony, she described not only the pain of loss, but also her daughter's transformation through ballet, how dance had built her confidence, discipline, and joy. "He didn't just take a life," she concluded. "He took away an entire future of beauty that she would have created." The transcript indicates that at this moment, Miller, who had remained impassive throughout much of the proceedings, dropped her eyes for the first time. On May 7, 1982, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Raymond Miller was found guilty of kidnapping and first-degree murder in the cases of Amanda Lawrence and Diane Reynolds, and of kidnapping in the cases of Melissa Bennett and Samantha Perkins. The ensuing sentencing phase was brief. Georgia was one of the states that retained the death penalty, and the heinous nature of the crimes justified, according to the unanimous jury, the maximum sentence. On May 21, 1982, Judge Harold Blackwood, real name according to public records, handed down the sentence. Raymond Miller would be executed in the electric chair. "Society cannot tolerate those who prey on the vulnerable, who turn innocence and art into targets of twisted obsession," Blackwood declared in his closing remarks. "This court sentences the defendant to death to be administered according to the laws of this state." The following years would see a series of appeals, as is standard in capital punishment cases in the United States. Miller remained on death row at the Georgia State Penitentiary in Reedsville, while his lawyers explored every legal avenue available, claims of improper procedures, circumstantial evidence, and eventually questions about his mental capacity. In 1986, a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation diagnosed Miller with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder with pathological fixations, but found him fully capable of understanding the nature of his crimes and the punishment. During his time on death row, Miller rarely received visitors. His parents, already deceased when the crimes occurred, left no other close relatives. Occasionally, journalists would attempt interviews, fascinated by the apparent normalcy of the man who had terrorized an entire region. In one of these rare conversations, given to a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in 1987, Miller made his closest statement to a public confession. "I wanted them to stay perfect forever, but nothing stays perfect, does it? Not even a memory." In March 1988, Miller's final appeal was denied by the Georgia Supreme Court. The execution date was set for April 15th of that year. Coincidentally or not, during the spring recital season at ballet academies across the state. In the days leading up to the execution, Miller finally agreed to provide more precise information about the whereabouts of the bodies of Melissa Bennett and Samantha Perkins, possibly motivated by the approaching end or some belated desire to provide closure to the families. Following their lead, authorities located remains in two distinct areas of the marshes, near an old abandoned dike for Melissa and on a small, rarely visited natural island for Samantha. The bodies, after years of exposure to the elements and local wildlife, offered limited evidence about the exact circumstances of their deaths, but finally allowed the families to perform long-delayed farewell rituals. Raymond Miller was executed as scheduled on the morning of April 15, 1988. According to official accounts, he refused a last meal and made no final statements. Among the witnesses present were representatives of the families of the four victims, united in their grief and in the search for closure that, many would later admit, never truly arrived. In the weeks following the execution, the communities of Savannah, Brunswick, St. Mary's, and Darien held joint memorials for the victims. Dance studios throughout the coastal region organized special performances, with 4 empty chairs in the front row symbolizing the lost girls. Scholarship funds were established in their names, allowing young women from low-income families to access ballet lessons, an attempt to transform tragedy into opportunity and beauty, the very art Miller had perverted with his obsession. The case of the missing dancers, as it became known in criminal records, left a lasting mark on the region's psyche. Security practices implemented during the height of the panic, mandatory escorts for students after classes, entry and exit systems, parking lot surveillance, remain in place at many gyms to this day, almost like rituals whose origins younger generations barely understand. For those who lived through that period, however, the sight of a blue Chevrolet Impala still triggers a protective instinct, a conditioned reflex that time has softened but never completely erased. The case files were officially closed in 1990, when the final forensic analyses were completed. Miller's personal diaries, recovered from his apartment and later from his cell, provided disturbing insights into his psychology. Beginning in the mid-1970s, the entries revealed a growing obsession with preserving artistic purity and increasingly frequent references to ballet as the supreme form of human beauty, condemned by biology to exist only briefly. Psychologists who analyzed these writings identified a progression, from aesthetic admiration to possessive fixation, from distant observation to a fantasy of absolute control. Miller, who briefly studied photography in his youth before abandoning his studies, frequently expressed frustration with the camera's inability to capture the true essence of movement. This dissatisfaction, experts theorized, eventually evolved into the drive to preserve not just the image, but the subject itself, a lethal distortion of artistic appreciation. The victims' families took different paths to process their trauma. The Bennetts moved west, seeking a fresh start in Arizona. The Reynoldses remained in Brunswick, becoming active advocates for victims' rights and helping to establish one of the first support centers for families of missing persons in the southeastern United States. Amanda Lawrence's mother, a former English teacher, devoted herself to writing poetry about grief and recovery, eventually publishing a collection that received critical acclaim. The Perkinses, perhaps the most private in their grief, established a small foundation that funded security measures for youth art academies throughout Georgia. The case also had lasting impacts on law enforcement practices in the region. The experience of coordinating a complex investigation across multiple jurisdictions led to the formalization of interagency cooperation protocols that remain in effect. The use of behavioral analysis, still in its infancy in the early 1980s, gained credibility after its role in building the profile that eventually led to Miller. More significantly, the initial delay in connecting the disappearances resulted in the implementation of regional alert systems for criminal patterns, precursors to the integrated databases that would become standard in the following decades. For longtime residents of coastal Georgia, the period from 1978 to 1982 remains a dark chapter in a region usually characterized by its natural beauty and peaceful pace. Occasionally, in quiet conversations on porches or in local bars, references to those years are still heard, a loaded euphemism that needs no elaboration. For many, Miller's execution represented not only justice, but the lifting of a shadow that had fallen over an entire generation of young people. Miller's car, the infamous Blue Impala, was eventually destroyed after all legal proceedings were completed, a symbolic act that many in the community considered necessary. Parts of the vehicle were melted down and turned into a small memorial plaque installed in the garden of the Victims of Violent Crime Memorial in Atlanta, with the simple inscription, "For those whose dance was stopped too soon." Dance studios in the coastal region performed an unofficial ritual after the execution, an energy cleansing, as some more spiritually inclined instructors described it. Windows were opened, rooms were purified with herbs, and in each studio, a short dance was performed in memory of the four girls. This act, repeated annually for a few years, eventually evolved into scholarships in their names and benefit performances. Raymond Miller, in his final written statement, given to the prison chaplain and made public after his execution, offered neither explicit confession nor repentance, only a cryptic reflection. The dance continues after the dancer. The movement remains in the air even when the body stops. I saw this clearly. Will others see it too? Experts debated for years the meaning of these words, a last-ditch attempt at narrative control, a twisted justification, or perhaps a glimpse into the fundamental disconnect that allowed Miller to commit such atrocities. Whatever the intention, his words remained a disturbing echo of a mind that had transformed appreciation into possession, art into horror. Over the years, the case gradually migrated from news reports to criminal history books, from everyday conversations to academic studies. Occasionally, documentaries revisit the story, interviewing retired investigators and distant relatives of the victims. One such documentary, produced in 1995, included restored footage of recitals where Miller could be seen in the background, a visual reminder of the proximity between normality and monstrosity, of the predator hiding in plain sight. The 1990s brought significant changes to Georgia's coastal region. Tourism development, the expansion of naval facilities, and the growing popularity of the Golden Isles gradually transformed the small port communities. New residents, with no direct connection to the events of 1978 to 1982, settled in the region, diluting the collective memory of the trauma. For these newcomers, the events remained a disturbing local history, something mentioned in historical tours or regional books, but without the visceral impact experienced by the previous generation. Dance studios thrived again, albeit with safety protocols so ingrained in their routine that their origins were rarely questioned. Security cameras, check-in and check-out records, and parent waiting areas, practices initially implemented in direct response to Miller's crimes, were now simply considered industry standard. In 1998, 20 years after Melissa Bennett's disappearance, a small ceremony was held at the Victims Memorial in Atlanta. Attendees included former investigators, surviving family members, and young dancers from the original academies. A special choreography, titled "Four Interrupted Movements," was performed by students the same age as the victims when they disappeared, a tribute to the lives lost and the dancers they never became. During this ceremony, Christopher Reynolds, Diane's brother and now a grown man, offered a reflection that many considered the most apt summary of the entire tragedy. For years, I thought this story was about what was stolen: lives, futures, innocence. Now I see that it's also about what couldn't be stolen, the memory, the impact of these girls, the way they changed our communities and our laws. The monster wanted to preserve them in his sick mind, to possess them forever. But in the end, they don't belong to him. They belong to the dance, to their families, to the story we continue to tell. The complete Miller case files were digitized in 1999 as part of a national project to preserve historical criminal records. Among the documents, analysts found a disturbing detail that had received little attention during the trial: an address book containing the names and information of more than 30 other ballet students in cities along the southeastern coast of the United States. This discovery raised the possibility of potential victims who never knew the danger that lurked within them, lives that continued uninterrupted thanks to the intervention of the investigation. Today, the Miller case remains a key study in police academies across the southeastern United States, used to demonstrate both the challenges of cross-jurisdictional investigation and the value of behavioral analysis. Investigators periodically revisit the case files using new forensic technologies, an exercise that has yielded additional insights into Miller's modus operandi, though no substantial revelations would alter the fundamental understanding of the case. The four girls, Melissa, Diane, Amanda, and Samantha, would be middle-aged women today, possibly with daughters of their own, perhaps some pursuing the path of dance. This alternate reality, the what-if that never materialized, remains a silent specter for those who knew the victims. For the broader community, however, they now exist primarily as symbols of vulnerability, of lives cut short, but also of institutional change and collective consciousness. The legacy of the case is complex and multifaceted. On the one hand, it exemplifies how a methodical predator can operate unnoticed in seemingly safe communities, exploiting trust and predictable routines. On the other, it demonstrates how tragedy can catalyze positive reforms, from improved police protocols to greater community awareness of child safety. Miller's crimes forced a difficult dialogue about surveillance and protection, about the balance between allowing children to flourish artistically and keeping them safe from threats rarely visible until it's too late. The dance studios of coastal Georgia today are vibrant, safe places where young people continue to explore the art that fascinated and eventually led Melissa, Diane, Amanda, and Samantha onto Raymond Miller's path. The older studios maintain small, discreet memorials, a plaque, a framed photograph, a preserved trophy, silent reminders of a history the community refuses to completely forget, even as it moves forward. The case of the missing ballerinas remains a distant echo of a different time, the late 1970s and early 1980s, when communities still operated with a level of interpersonal trust that seems almost naive through contemporary lenses. It represents a turning point for those small towns, a moment that divided time into before and after, when doors began to be locked more frequently and strangers were observed with more wary eyes. For criminologists, Miller exemplifies a specific type of predator, methodically selective, patient, with a pattern of victimization rigidly defined by aesthetic and symbolic criteria rather than simple opportunity. His fixation on ballet as an expression of purity and transient perfection represents a lethal distortion of artistic appreciation, the transformation of admiration into possession, of contemplation into predation. Looking back through the lens of the nearly 50 years that separate us from the beginning of this dark story, we can see how the Miller case occurred at a transitional moment in American consciousness about serial crime, after notorious cases like Bundy and Gacy, but before the FBI fully formalized its profiling techniques, and before the widespread implementation of investigative technologies we now consider fundamental. It was a period when the public was just beginning to understand that monsters could hide beneath ordinary appearances, that danger did not always come from visibly threatening strangers, but sometimes from peripheral figures who had occupied spaces in the community for years without arousing suspicion. Time continues its inexorable flow. Georgia's small coastal towns have evolved, expanded, and in some cases, reinvented themselves. Brunswick today bears little resemblance to the fishing community of 1979. St. Mary's has become a tourist gateway to Cumberland Island. Savannah is an international cultural destination. New buildings rise where old ones stood, new faces populate the streets, and for many current residents, the name Raymond Miller means nothing. And yet, in certain circles, the story persists. Grandparents who were young parents during those dark years still warn their grandchildren to be careful, to always report where they are, to never accept rides. Veteran police officers share the case with recruits as a formative study. Older ballet teachers still pause momentarily when they see dark cars parked near their studios for too long, a conditioned reflex an echo of fear that time has softened but not completely erased. Perhaps the true impact of the Miller case cannot be measured in policy changes or institutional practices, but in the collective consciousness it generated, the understanding that community vigilance is a shared responsibility, that children's safety depends not only on authorities, but on a network of care that involves parents, educators, neighbors, and concerned strangers. The four young dancers lost to Miller's twisted obsession left a legacy that transcends their absence, a lasting call to balance nurturing young talents and protecting inherent vulnerabilities. The silence that permeates the Georgia swamps carries many secrets. For years it carried the secrets of Raymond Miller. Today it carries only the distant echo of a story the community chooses to remember, not to perpetuate fear, but to honor those whose dances were prematurely cut short, and to ensure that no other child disappears on their way home after seeking beauty through art. This narrative is based on archives and historical accounts. Some names have been changed. We seek to understand, not sensationalize. The outcome matches public conviction records. No graphic violence was described.